Imagine, if we can, for a moment, that we have stepped into a wondrous sort of town hall and we're all crowded in together. And I would come up to the microphone and I would tap it and I would say, welcome everyone, welcome. My name is Chris Gordon. I am the programming manager for Readings, and on behalf of Readings and on behalf of Monash University Publishing House, I welcome each and every one of you here. My role today is really very simple. I am really just the person behind it all. But before I introduce our extraordinary speakers today, starting with Julian Burnside, I would like us all to take a moment in our busy, busy lives to reflect that no matter where we stand, if you're living on Australian ground, you're living on stolen property. Of course, this beautiful country that is filled with so many storylines, so many songlines, where we can use and understand to make sense of this beautiful country. I think when we are reflecting on the history that we have here in Australia, we have to acknowledge that all of us are guilty, that all of us have played a part in harming the Indigenous owners of this beautiful, beautiful land. And until, of course, we reconcile that within our hearts, it's never going to get better for those people. At the moment, I'm speaking from the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respect on behalf of each and every one of you here tonight to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also want us to join together and show our gratitude and our deepest respect for these beautiful traditional owners of our glorious land. And now, of course, it is my great pleasure and indeed an incredible honour for a Monday night that little old me gets to introduce someone, a pillar of Australian society, someone who I think that we all aspire to believe in and to think like. Of course, I'm talking about Julian Burnside, AO QC. He's a lawyer, an author, a human and refugee advocate, and he's one of those blokes that's very easy to talk to. And surely that's his greatest skill. Over to you, Julian. It is such a treat to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much indeed. And I want to just start by acknowledging that Chris has put on this launch for Readings, which is Australia's finest bookshop. And sorry for the free plug, but there we go. The other people joining us tonight are Jen Robinson, who is Assange's lawyer in London, and Suelette Dreyfus, of course, who it knows more about this subject than pretty much anyone. And I want to start by capturing what Philip Adams said in the first 2 paragraphs of his foreword to this book. It's a remarkably perceptive observation that he made. He starts his foreword this way: odd, is it not, a paradox, that Australia gave birth to the 2 most powerful media figures in the world, both creating global empires from humble provincial beginnings, both seen as dangerous, problematic, both blamed for changing the course of history, both condemned for putting Trump in the White House. There the similarities end. One is a multi-billionaire, the other in solitary confinement in Belmarsh prison, facing a life worse than death in a US supermax. One is Rupert, the other Julian. It's a very, very astute observation. What Assange did was to dramatically change the way in which information about the government's dark secrets should get to us, and as a result, he's been locked up. I'm inclined to think that the reason he's been pursued is because of collateral murder, which was released as a result of it being leaked to him. He set up WikiLeaks as a way of not being able to catch whistleblowers. Collateral murder showed that the American government had been engaged in deliberately murdering innocent human beings in Iraq. what is fascinating is that WikiLeaks made the disclosure of collateral murder possible, but other publishers in the industry made sure that most of us, maybe all of us, saw collateral murder. The other publishers are not being pursued. Assange is. Now, one of the people who knows him best is Jen Robinson, who has been involved as his lawyer for a long time. And Jen, I'm very interested in asking you from the outset, what is going to happen on the 4th of January when the judgment of the court hearing the extradition application is handed down?
Thank you, Julian, and thanks to Readings for hosting us for this event. On the 4th of December, we will get judgment from the magistrate on whether or not Julian will be extradited. Of course, both sides have already indicated that there will be an appeal. The appeal would be to the High Court, and you need permission to appeal. So in all likelihood, if, for example, she orders him to be extradited, it's unlikely that any appeal would be heard until the late summer in Europe. So presuming we get permission to appeal, or one of the parties do, that's when the next hearing is likely to be.
And what, in your instinct, as a matter of observation, what do you think is the most likely outcome on the 4th of January?
I think extradition hearings are very difficult. The presumption is always in favor, more on the side of extradition than it's not. So it's always a bit of an uphill battle, and this case is more difficult than any other. So I think, we have to wait to see what happens. I can't prejudge, but I think people need to understand how difficult extradition hearings are, this one in particular.
And how's he coping?
I mean, Julian is in an incredibly difficult circumstance at the moment because of the COVID outbreak in his wing of the prison, which means that he has been locked in his cell. He's not allowed to leave, even to have a shower. Obviously, the risk to him is incredibly high because of the ongoing respiratory issues he's had because of such a long period in detention, both in the embassy and now in Belmarsh. So it's been a very lonely time for him. Not only is he in a high security prison, but with the COVID pandemic, it's meant that he's had hardly a social visit all year. He hasn't had a legal visit. The only time I've seen him in person was at court in the cells underneath the prison. And even that was so limited in terms of the time we were able to have with him to capture half an hour here or there at the beginning or at the end of the day before he would be bundled up into the van and taken back to Belmarsh. So he's been on his own a lot, and I think it's difficult to be in Belmarsh at any time, but during a pandemic makes it appalling.
Suelette, if I can ask you a question. In your essay in this book, I should have explained the whole point about this is the launch of this book, A Secret Australia. And each of us, along with other people, have got essays in the book. Suelette, in your essay, you say most journalism before WikiLeaks was about the journalist as filter. The journalist got to look at all the financial spreadsheets revealing how public funds were really spent, and we had to take it on faith that the reporter told us the truth. If we had a question, the best we could do was write a letter to the editor or the journalist. Now, would you like to give your explanation of the way WikiLeaks changed that? I think Suelette, you're on mute. Suelette,
yes.
Your microphone, there you go. Now you're okay.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't being allowed to unmute myself. There you go.
Yeah.
I thank you very much to Readings for having me here tonight. And I will say I have a bit of a cough, so if I start snuffling and coughing, I don't actually have COVID. I've been tested, but I am not 100%. So a couple of thoughts on this. I mean, there is no doubt that WikiLeaks and Julian transformed the relationship between the public and their source of news. And a key element of that was, do we have to trust the story that's told to us? And this is incredibly prescient because, what Julian really mainstreamed with WikiLeaks, among other things, was this idea of publishing the whole data set with the story, linked to the story, so that the person who's reading the story can tell, is the journalist telling me the truth? Now, why is that important? Well, it's important in the sort of best of times, because you'd like to be able to see, is there more information that's relevant? It's particularly important in the era of fake news. When we are given disinformation, when politicians are lying and spinning, like there's no tomorrow, being able to have that data set, being able to have that original information makes it possible not only to tell when the information that's given to us today is lies and spin, but also tomorrow. It becomes an archive. And that archive is, in a sense, the archive of truth. And I think that was always one of his objectives with it. And because he had a unique among journalists understanding of different technologies, how they worked, and creative ways to adapt them, he was able to say, okay, if we can use these different approaches, we can provide a different sort of journalism, a different sort of news, a more reliable sort of news. And I think that made him very unpopular, not with readers, not with us. We wanted to know the truth. It's interesting. I spoke to someone, a former finance journalist not long ago, who said to me, God, when WikiLeaks was able to report regularly, he said, you wanted to read the news every morning, even in the mainstream newspaper. It was like something you look forward to. So I think there is that kind of a thrill, but really it pissed off the traditional old style media. And so you had places like the New York Times kind of treating him like something that, was picked up on the bottom of your shoe walking down the street. And he's just a source. He's not a journalist. Well, that's just not true. The site published news stories, many more news stories in the course of its time than had been published in that time period by many mainstream organizations with 100 times the resources. So I don't think that's right. Now, the good news is a number of those traditional media organizations have suddenly discovered the world has changed. All of their advertising dollars have gone to the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, and they're in dire financial straits. And actually, it turns out in this new world that the WikiLeaks of the world are not the enemy. Further, that the extradition case that Julian is facing, and we have to remind ourselves, every time you think about Belmarsh, every time you think about him in that prison, this is a man who is innocent in the eyes of the law in the UK, right? He is not in Belmarsh because he's waiting on some sort of trial for a criminal conviction in the UK. And so anyway, there he is, and you say, okay, what is important about this? Here is a guy who, if he gets extradited, no one is safe. No ABC journalist based in Jakarta, no CBC journalist out of Canada who's based in Europe or any number of other places. All of these journalists, if they write a story that the US government doesn't like, the precedent that Julian's extradition will set is that the US government can reach its long arm out and say, pluck this person out of their country, bring them to the US, put them on trial and lock them up because we don't like what they say.
Now, timing matters a lot. And I'm wondering, and this is actually a question for both of you, when the Pentagon Papers thing was, what's that, the late 70s, early 80s, Daniel Ellsberg set a new precedent in America on the footing that it might be a crime to leak a document that is secret or top secret, but it's not a crime to publish it. And that, as I understand it, is central to Assange's position. But that was before 9/11. And collateral murder and everything since has been after 9/11. So did 9/11 affect the way the authorities are seeing the reporting of things like collateral murder or the Iraq emails?
Can I just jump into that momentarily, wearing my journalist hat? So I used to be a journalist on a daily newspaper as a staff reporter. And I think when 9/11 happened, and I recall very distinctly having a conversation with Julian when the Twin Towers came down, when it was live happening on TV, he rang me up at the time. And he said, this is terrible, but it's terrible for many more reasons than what is actually happening. And what he could see was that it was going to be terrible because there would be a war, and that a lot of lies would be told to justify that war. There are a lot of interest in that war, including companies who want to sell the armaments of war for a lot of money and service the war for a lot of money. But the thing that really, I think, disturbed him, and he saw this and talked about it a lot in the months that followed that, is the amount of transition that was going on between the traditional media and these powers of war, government and war institutions, army, et cetera, in controlling the story, the embedded journalist scenario. You only go to get to report on the war, what's happening in the war, if you report what we say you can report. And if you don't do that, then you don't get to go and you don't report on it. Well, that's not journalism. That's PR spin and yes men nodding their heads. So yes, I think it was a fundamental change.
And Jen, do you have a view about the significance of 9/11 and the timing in the application of the Daniel Ellsberg Pentagon Papers ruling?
Well, I think there's two things around the post 9/11 world, and one of which is the way in which America started behaving around the world. And of course, that was a large driver behind many of the publications for WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks has been incredibly important in revealing evidence of US wrongdoing in this so-called war on terror that followed 9/11. So I think there's two things. There's one, and these are the publications that WikiLeaks is being prosecuted, well, Julian is being prosecuted in relation to. We're talking about the Guantanamo files. We had expert evidence before the court from, and witness statements from the court, in the court from Clive Stafford Smith from Reprieve, for example, who spoke about how important WikiLeaks disclosures were with respect to not just the Guantanamo Bay cases that they were running to try to get justice for those men that have been locked up for so long, but also revealing evidence about US drone strikes in Pakistan and other US activities post 9/11. So you see an organization which is publishing evidence of this stuff, highlighting for the public what is being done in the US's name in this so-called war on terror. At the same time, an increasingly aggressive approach towards leakers and journalists. So of course, there was the sort of the widespread phrase that under Obama, more leakers have been prosecuted than under any other president combined. But what's different about the Trump administration's approach is that the Trump administration has no qualms about prosecuting journalists. And, we saw that play out in our case as well. And we see it in Julian's case, that there was no indictment under the Obama administration. This is a precedent that is being pursued by the Trump administration. There was no indictment until, consistent with the public statements being made by Obama and by Eric Holder, the Attorney General at the time, that no journalist would go to prison on their watch. The Trump administration clearly takes a different approach, and it is one that is different. It is more aggressive. It is one that is seeking to break down the traditional distinction between prosecuting a source for having revealed information and prosecuting a journalist for having received and published that information. And that distinction is such an important one, but one that the US government in this case is trying to break down. And it effectively is meaning that journalists will be found to have conspired with, be in conspiracy with and be accused of the same crime that the source is committing. And that's a dangerous one. And as we heard from Trevor Timm from the Freedom of the Press Foundation, will mean the end of national security journalism, because this indictment isn't just about what the prosecution continually says. This is about publishing information and putting people at risk. It's not. This indictment absolutely covers receipt and possession and publication of information. And that's what national security journalists do all the time.
Now, you probably know this better than anyone else who's involved in this. Obviously, the point about WikiLeaks is our right to know. And the question arises squarely whether Assange should be punished for enabling us to know. Has anyone been harmed by the things that have been disclosed by WikiLeaks?
The short answer is no. Yeah. So the indictment that came in this case, there's no further evidence. Well, US government prosecutor on oath has not provided evidence of anyone being physically harmed.
Yeah.
We know that was the evidence on oath from military figures in Chelsea Manning's proceedings back in 2012 and 2013. There's no, it's simply overstated and exaggerated accusations being made, but without evidence. So I don't know if you want to address that as well, but we certainly don't have evidence of it in the case, no matter what he said.
Suelette, are you aware of anyone having been harmed as a result of the disclosures?
No, but I am aware that there was a review done by the US government, by the military, as to whether or not there was harm done. I think that was in 2011, but I'd need to check the date. And that concluded that no one had been physically harmed or killed as a result of the data. And what was interesting is, even as that story was emerging, there had been in the months before various military figures who had stood up and said, Assange has blood on his hands, WikiLeaks has blood on their hands. And so this is really about the false narrative for political purposes. And that is the theme that has occurred frequently with the WikiLeaks story, is the false narrative that's been planted. I can't tell you the number of things that have been written about and published about Julian Assange that are just untrue. They are just untrue. And that is, I am not sure, you couldn't say that that is all by design. Certainly, sometimes you just have sloppy journalists or news is, regurgitated. But I would also suspect that some of it was by design.
Yeah. There is obviously some justification for some matters known to government remaining secret. Is there anything that has been published by WikiLeaks that we should not, in all proper considerations, have been aware of?
I think when you look at information, you have to examine a couple of things. Yes, there may be some risk in publishing information, but you have to look at also what are the returns, what's the ROI in providing the information to the public. And the overwhelming evidence is the information that's been provided by WikiLeaks over time has served an enormous public interest. In fact, I think if you were a student of change agendas in changing public attitudes, you would say that, WikiLeaks revelations made a significant contribution towards changing public attitudes to the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. And that's a profoundly important thing.
Yeah, well, collateral murder had a pretty significant impact on people's attitude to the war in Iraq. Seeing innocent civilians being murdered by the Americans is pretty significant.
Can I just add, Julian?
What was going on in Guantanamo was pretty important too.
That collateral murder video is really important for another reason. It is the case study in lies. So we were told Chelsea Manning is going to be prosecuted. Oh, because she leaked that. She leaked that secret information. Well, it wasn't classified. Reuters had gone to the US government and said, what's the story? What's actually happened here? Oh, no. It was just insurgents. Oh, no, it wasn't just insurgents. Really? Were there any children? No children. No children at all, right? So it's just lie. Do you have any evidence of this? No footage. Just lie. And that case study illustrates the importance of having the information in the public. And it contrasts with the public lies that are told by those who are embarrassed by it. And that's the role of good journalism, isn't it?
And your essay, I think, captures that point very well. You say, who was the winner out of all of this? The public. We saw news as we have never seen it before, day after day, engaging, enlightening. It made people want to buy newspapers again. People began to look forward to sitting down with their morning cup of coffee and their newspapers. It engaged people with in the political processes of their countries, helped them think critically, and made them ask more questions of their leaders in business and politics alike. And Jen, you would have seen that profound effect on people's inclination to know what is going on and to question their leaders as a result.
Yes, definitely. Sorry, I was waiting. Is there a question? Of course. Look, I think WikiLeaks disclosures have been so important in so many ways. And one of the things I talk about in the book, which is important, I think, for me and Julian, for your work and for our colleagues' work around the world, is the ways in which WikiLeaks material have been used in accountability efforts in human rights cases. And so I think we talk a lot about the journalistic impact, and that's incredibly important, as Suelette says. And I think her chapter does set out well the impact that Cablegate had. And certainly, as someone who was here watching the story unfold and sort of at the center of it, advising WikiLeaks, it was a remarkable story. But what was important for me, and it was important for me even before I met Julian, and I was watching what WikiLeaks was publishing before I met him. I was, the Guantanamo torture manual. I remember that very well. I remember, the Minton report, this sort of WikiLeaks breaking this gag order here about a toxic oil spill off the coast of Africa at a time when super injunctions were a real problem in this jurisdiction, which meant a super injunction is one where you can't, not only can you not report the underlying facts, you can't report the fact of the injunction covering the underlying facts. And so, which is obviously a massive issue for free speech. So I was watching WikiLeaks publish this information. I thought, this is an interesting organization from a human rights point of view, let alone a journalistic point of view, because if we can get our hands on these documents, then maybe we can do something about it. And I had lots of conversations with Julian over the years. There was almost like a frustration on his behalf because so much information was coming out, but we weren't seeing it being used in the practical ways that he really wanted to see it being used. And slowly we have seen that. So I talk in the book about how the cables were used in this wonderful documentary, No Fire Zone, which was about the Sri Lankan military attacks on the Tamils, which was tweeted about by Prime Minister David Cameron at the time, which then resulted in a UN investigation into war crimes. We've seen WikiLeaks material, and we had evidence of this before the court here in our extradition challenge, being used in the European Court of Human Rights in the case of al-Masri about CIA rendition and torture, and the pressure that was brought to bear on European countries not to prosecute for these unlawful acts on their territory. In my own work, I've cited WikiLeaks cables in the International Court of Justice in the Chagos Islands case. So did the government of Mauritius. WikiLeaks material, and we now know as a result of the UK Supreme Court decision that WikiLeaks cables are admissible as evidence in British courts, which will obviously have a knock-on effect in common law courts around the world. So I think we're only just seeing the significance of this material. And, that's just in a context of human rights accountability. And I'm just listing a couple of cases, that was essential in the drone strike litigation in Pakistan. Imran Khan has spoken passionately about the role of WikiLeaks in showing Pakistanis what was really happening in their country and who was involved. And so, and that's before we even talk about the historical significance. So the stories that we've all read. Sorry, I've pushed on to mute. Does that mean you want me to stop talking? But some of the more significant the stories that we initially saw published, the journalists looked at the cables, looked at the immediately obvious stories, and then that's what was published in the first batch of publications, both at the international level and then the domestic level by each country-based newspaper around the world. But Julian's often said to me, Jen, the significance of this we won't know until there's an event, and then people will go back and access the material, and more stories will come out of that material that sits there online waiting for us to access it. And that's the power of that public library, because it's a reference point, and it's a reference point that journalists and lawyers can continually go back to. So that I don't think we yet appreciate the value of that material.
Now, a point you make repeatedly in your essay in the book is that Australia took no action to help Assange. Where does that leave Australian citizens who get in difficulty overseas?
Well, it's an excellent point, and one that concerns me greatly. I work on lots of different cases around the world for Australian citizens. If we could everybody be on mute, that would be great. including a number of Australian dual nationals, Australian Egyptians, who the Australian government has provided assistance to and has played a significant role in making sure that they get home to Australia. In Julian's case, we have, as you know, Julian, because you've been part of our team, we have repeatedly reached out to the Australian government since the very beginning. When we were dealing with the Swedish issue, Julian was always willing to face justice in Sweden, but not at the risk of US extradition. And the Australian government refused to ask for us the assurances that he needed to be able to deal with that case. The Ecuadorian government, once he sought asylum, sought those assurances that we were asking for, and the Swedish government refused to give them. You know, whether it was like after the UN working group, we reached out to the Australian government. I met with Julie Bishop. We told her what was happening with the working group on arbitrary detention. The Australian government did nothing. I really do believe that if the Australian government had been asking more serious questions and protesting to the United States about the treatment of Julian, that we wouldn't be in the world we are now, where it would not have been politically possible for our ally to take this kind of action against an Australian citizen, except in the knowledge that the Australian government would do nothing, and they're doing nothing. And the question we need to ask is, the Australian government, a conservative government, was able to bring home David Hicks, who was convicted of terrorist offences, was able to bring home David Hicks. Julian is a publisher. He is a journalist. He's an award-winning journalist. He won the Sydney Peace Prize for these publications. And this is a precedent that is going to set a dangerous one for journalists, not just in the United States, but everywhere. It is right and proper that the Australian government exercises diplomatic protection over this citizen, irrespective of what he had done, but particularly in this case, because of what he's done. And so I think it is embarrassing to me as an Australian citizen how our government has been so concerned about not rocking the boat with the United States. If we can't ask this of our special ally, then who can we ask it of? And if this was an Australian journalist facing extradition to Saudi Arabia or to China to face prosecution for publishing truthful information about either of those countries, the Australian government would be up in arms. And why not? Because it's the United States? I'm sure you have something to say about that.
Well, no, I mean, I'm interested in this because until he was removed from the embassy and taken to Belmarsh, it seemed to me it would have been possible, depending on the politics, would have been relatively easy for Australia and the Brits to come to an agreement that they would enable his removal from the embassy to be taken directly to a plane bound for Australia, and he would not be intercepted by the police in the trip to the airport. And that way he would have been removed into Australia to await whatever his fate would have been. But despite the best efforts back then, and I'm talking second half of 2012 when he went into the embassy, nothing at all was tried. In fact, on the contrary, as you know, I visited him there in July, I think, of 2012. And with some assistance from him, we wrote a letter to Nicola Roxon, who was the then Attorney General, I think, Labor government, setting out the risks associated with him being removed to Sweden, which was that he'd be sent over to America to face the fate that Manning was then facing. And she not only did not answer the letter, she gave it to an underling to answer, and they did nothing, absolutely nothing. So, you know, to say, well, it's a conservative government that hasn't interfered, overlooks the fact that both major parties, while in government, have refused to do anything practical to help him.
Not only just not do anything practical, have actively undermined him. So whether we start with the Gillard government, a Labor government at the very outset, people forget that Robert McClellan, the then Attorney General, was talking about cancelling his passport. Julia Gillard gave a press conference not long just after Cablegate was published, saying that he had acted unlawfully. And of course, there was an AFP investigation that showed he had not committed any crime under Australian law, let alone anywhere else. But to have a Prime Minister coming out and stating that an Australian citizen had acted unlawfully without having properly considered the facts was pretty outrageous. And then we had, I mean, how many governments have we had since in Australia? If we were a Pacific island, we would have invaded ourselves to create. So, you know, whether a Conservative or Labor government, neither have been great. Malcolm Turnbull spoke out forcefully against Julia Gillard for what she said about Julian at that time. You know, he acted in the Spycatcher case, so he has personal understanding, intimate personal understanding of the law as it applies to publication and publication offences in Australia. And he came out and said Julian had not committed a crime. It was protected in Australia. He shouldn't be prosecuted for having published the secrets of a foreign state. But of course, once he became Prime Minister, Malcolm did nothing. So, you know, it really raises the question, which is what comes through in the book, about what Australia's position is in the world. Because you have these people who either, when they're not in power, look at Bob Carr, what he said about Julian after his time as Foreign Minister, and look at what he did as Foreign Minister. The question arises about what is Australia's position in the world? What can our government actually do politically? How subservient are we to the United States? Because government after government have done nothing. And as soon, you know, people, once they're out of positions of power, say, oh, yes, we really must do that. Well, why not do it when you're there, when you have the ability to do something? And that begs massive questions for me about Australia's role in the world and
Now,
our sovereignty.
I was just going to say, Suelette, it's time to unmute yourself if you have comments to make on all of that you've just heard.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, it goes to the question of why have an Australian passport? You know, if your government is not going to try and look after you when you're in strife overseas in a foreign prison, you know, isn't that the whole purpose, in a sense, of the idea of you are Australian, you are part of this community, the leaders of this community look after other Australians, not abandon them, particularly when there've been dirty deals done. So we know from an Italian journalist who ran an FOI case in the UK that the British prosecutors in the case deleted important emails about the case, his case, and correspondence with the Swedish government, where effectively the British government, the British prosecutor, was saying to the Swedish prosecutor, no, don't come here, don't interview Julian in the embassy, no, because of course interviewing him in the embassy would have revealed that there was no case against him, the case in Sweden would have collapsed, the whole environment would have changed, and the smearing would have stopped. And instead we see that the Crown Prosecutor's Office was rather a blocker, a deliberate blocker, and then a deleter of emails. How can you delete emails when it's both against the policy of the prosecutor's office and about a live case? It's insane. So when you know these sorts of forces are being brought to bear against your citizen in you know, kind of dirty tricks, and by your closest allies, of course you must stand up. Of course you must. These are your people. They are, you know, if you are the foreign minister, they are your children. You need to take care of them when they're abroad. So that, I think, is a particularly concerning element of it. I do despair about the fact that there really don't seem to be a lot of spines in Canberra that are not wobbly and who feel themselves so dependent on the goodwill of a Trump administration that they can't actually politely, nicely, even behind the scenes, somewhat forcefully, ask the hard questions, even if it's not done in a way that is out in public and likely to cause embarrassment.
Our politicians have done quite a lot in relation to the protection of whistleblowers. Ostensibly, they support the position of whistleblowers. What impact will this all have on the conduct of whistleblowers?
Well, clearly the Commonwealth whistleblower legislation, while a fantastic first step, has got a lot of holes. And I believe we're going to see the first case go to full trial using that legislation next year, early next year, whistleblowing about a very important public interest case. I think in many ways, you know, what I wrote about in my chapter is WikiLeaks was a first in a whole lot of things and has changed the landscape in journalism. It has introduced the secure anonymous Dropbox, now used by the New York Times and a number of European publications, but also by the Anti-Fraud Agency in Spain, in Italy. The use of verification journalism, the data sets that I spoke about, the global collaborative journalism with more than 80 media organizations in different countries for the US cables, publishing in partnership so that the news story that is both local and internationally contextualized gets to the public in the public interest. I think that in this case, also, WikiLeaks is breaking new ground. I'm not sure whether or not those who break new ground are the ones who suffer the most, because when the ground is broken, they pay a terrible cost and nobody is there to catch them or defend them. And the people who come after them benefit, and we all benefit. But if we're not writing letters to Canberra, asking questions of our politicians, right? If you want to know what any of you can do today, sitting here just listening, besides buying this wonderful book from Readings, it's to just send an email to your state senators, to your senators in the state you're in, to your representatives, your House of Representatives in the state you're in, and make inquiries. Also make inquiries of state and even local politicians. So some local councils in Victoria have come out in support of Julian Assange, made statements, passed resolutions. All of these things matter. But if we just take and are the beneficiaries of these people who move first, who are the changers, and we don't protect them when they're being downtrodden, then what message does that send to the innovators who come after them? It says, keep your mouth shut and go away, not change society for the benefit of all of us.
If, Jen, if the Australian government was willing to help David Hicks, who had been convicted after a significant and well-publicised trial, why will the Australian government not help Assange?
It's an excellent question, Julian, and one I do not have the answer to. The Australian government can and could intervene at any point and haven't. And like I said, I do not think we would be in a world in which Julian would be in Belmarsh prison if the Australian government had stood up and said this is not on. And it's putting, not only is it putting really is an Australian citizen suffering, but the US is putting its allies in difficulty. So the British government is now in a position where they're acting as the agent of the United States in pursuing this case. And what very few journalists understand is that the very nature of an extradition case requires the judge to make a finding about double criminality. So by pursuing this case against an Australian journalist and publisher outside of the country, we are going to get an extradition decision in this country, which if the prosecutors have their way, is saying, well, you could be prosecuted for this here too. The Official Secrets Act won't save you. And so it's doubling down, and there's never been a prosecution of a publisher under the Official Secrets Act in this country. But we are about to get an extradition decision, which the government is pushing in order to be able to extradite Julian, is pushing for a decision which would have a finding about that. And so British journalists aren't properly, I think, are concerned and are becoming more and more concerned about what this case means here. So it's an Australian citizen. It's a case that's being pursued that's going to affect journalistic protections all over the world. The Australian government could do the right thing. And I think there are many in government in the United States, many prosecutors, many people in politics who are also concerned about this. So the Australian government ought to understand that this is something that is causing consternation here. It is causing consternation in the United States. And in fact, if they were to do the right thing, they may well be celebrated for it, and certainly would be celebrated at home.
Well, now, I guess, we've spent a lot of time, all of us, talking about the impact on the news system and the way governments behave and the way governments perform. But at the heart of it, there's one aspect which I think, Jen, only you can discuss, and that is, how's Assange doing? How's he doing personally?
Look, I don't know how he survives. And I've said that over and over since he was first inside the embassy and now in Belmarsh prison. The conditions inside Belmarsh are horrific. because of the, and particularly so because of the pandemic. So as I explained at the outset, until I saw him in court during the extradition proceedings in September, I hadn't seen him since the hearing in February, not in person. We haven't been able to visit him in prison because of the COVID restrictions. And I believe he may have had 1 or 2 social visits before the lockdown started again, but he's been incredibly isolated. And now, because there's a COVID outbreak on his wing, he's not able to leave his cell for anything, to wash. They're not allowed to go and have a shower. And that's been going on for 2 weeks now. So he's so isolated, and so I think it's very lonely. I can only imagine what that's like. We also had psychiatric evidence put before the court about the risk that he will commit suicide, that he has made it very clear that he is a risk. And if extradited, he will do that. Think about the future for Julian Assange at the moment, unless this case can be put to a stop. He has already been under some form of restriction on his liberty since December 2010. So we're coming up on 10 years. He has been in a high security prison for more than 18 months during COVID without really seeing anyone. And he's looking at the prospect of potentially either extradition to the United States, where he'll be placed in special administrative measures in prison, which is effectively, lawyers call it the darkest black hole of the US prison system, where he will not be able to speak to us without it being monitored, and where he will be far away from his family and anyone who knows him and can support him. And the prospect of a criminal trial in the United States in Alexandria, which is where the jury will be pulled from government contractors and the intelligence agencies. And if he appeals all the way, it could be a very long time before the US Supreme Court finds in his favor. Now, for anyone, can you imagine that as a prospect? You've got 2 little kids and a partner. It is so unbelievably depressing a prospect. And people forget he is a human being. He is this big cultural figure now globally. He is a journalist, he is an editor, but he's also a person. And going in to see him in that prison is heartbreaking and so egregious that it's hard to describe. I try to tell people sometimes what it's like to visit him when I'm actually able to. The security measures that I have to go to, walking past other prisoners this is a prison of violent prisoners, walking past cells, consultation rooms with people who have been accused of heinous violent crimes. And then there's Julian Assange sitting there. It's
Well, thank you for that. And Suelette, unless there's something urgent that you need to add to all of that, I think we've just about run out of time. So I think I'll hand it back to Christine, and thank you both for your contribution to this remarkable story, in particular your essays, and really for anyone who thinks these ideas have any significance at all, I recommend the book. It's really full of fascinating information.
If I can say one last thing, don't just buy the book for yourself, buy it, read it, but pass it on to one more person, one friend, one neighbor, ask them to read the book. And by this, we can spread the truth about what's going on, what has gone on, and the importance of the work of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
And use the book as the basis of a communication to whatever MPs are most relevant to you. So thank you. Jen, thank you. And it's back to Christine.
My role now is just to thank you, Julian, for bringing this all together, and to thank you, everyone out there. Let's all do our bit. Let's make sure that we all tell at least 5 people about this event that's happened here tonight. Do buy the book. Do keep reading. Do keep thinking. And to all of you, stay safe. To Jen, Suelette, and Julian, thank goodness for you guys. Thank goodness. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Good night.